Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming. I'm Rachel Sylvester, I'm the political editor of The Observer and I was previously chair of the Times Crime and Justice Commission. So I'm really pleased to be here looking at the future of the criminal justice system, and what I think is so brilliant about Nesta and about this day in particular is it's about solutions, it's not just about problems. So we will talk about what's going wrong, but I also hope that our brilliant panel will be able to come up with some ideas for what needs to happen to make things better as well. So I'm really delighted to introduce Andrea Coomer, who's the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform, John Yates, Chief Executive of the Youth Endowment Fund, Penelope Gibbs, Director of the charity Transform Justice, and Ian Lawrence, who's General Secretary of NAPO, which represents probation officers and family court workers. And then you've also got access, I hope, to Slido on your phone, which you can either get via this QR code or this special number. And we're actually going to start this session by asking you your opinion. So what I want you to do is to identify, can we identify a single significant cause for what's going wrong at the moment, or is the problem very complex and diffuse? So I want you to choose one word. What's the biggest single cause of failure of the criminal justice system? And if you enter that into Slido, then hopefully, magically, in a few minutes, the answer will come up. And while that's happening, our brilliant panelists can say what they think. So, Andrea, do you want to start? We're starting with what's
single
wrong.
Word.
Not a single word. You can have a more nuanced approach.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Howard League's work focuses on the kind of back end of the criminal justice system where people have find themselves in prison. So, I mean, key issue is underinvestment for decades. I think a massive disconnect between political drives towards being tough on crime, sort of punitive populism, mixed with sentences getting longer and longer and longer. So more crimes and people getting longer sentences, and then a complete underinvestment in every element of the criminal justice system, but also in the social scaffolding that prevents people from going to prison in the first place, which is what these people know a lot about.
John, you see a lot of that side of it with your work with the Youth Endowment Fund. How much of this this is interesting. So this is the biggest causes of failure of the criminal justice system, according to our audience. Inequality is right in the middle. That's fascinating, isn't it? Does that chime with your work, John?
Yeah, it does. And maybe I'll build on that in a second if I can, because I think it is an important word. So if the Howard League is at the back end, we're probably at the front end. So the Youth Endowment Fund is what can you do to prevent, particularly children, getting involved in crime and violence. I think something is broken. I think it's worth working out what it is for the prevention end. So if we just step back very little, one thing the state should offer us is safety. So safety from being attacked or from obviously losing your life. If you look at the adult population, if we're going to say things are bad, you've got to admit they were bad 10 years ago because they haven't really moved. So, you know, your chance of being murdered in this country if you're an adult hasn't changed in 10 years. Your chance of ending up in hospital having been attacked hasn't moved very much. If you're a child, it's quite different. So the number of children dying of homicide in this country has gone up by 10% in that period, and the chances of ending up in hospital having been attacked has gone up by about 60%, 60. So something's gone awry, and so I think it's worth focusing on children and young people. What's at the root of it? Well, I think the first thing to say, and I'll try and be brief, but the services are just not keeping up. And so if we look at, we've had basically a really dismal decade. So youth services funding is down by about 50%. But the need is really high. So the number of children who are now looked after has gone up by about 20%. The number of children with mental health episodes is up by about 100%. The number of children who are absent from school has gone up by 10%. Now, there's a lot underpinning all of that, from COVID to austerity to social media to etc. But I think if we're going to solve a problem, it'll be what can we do on the prevention side. And I think inequality does play in, because if you talk to children who commit acts of violence, the thing you'll get more than anything else, I think, is a sense that children feel that they don't matter. And they want to feel that they matter, and violence sometimes flows out of that.
Fascinating. Penelope, I mean, if you look at how the word cloud's evolving, we've got mental health still now coming up, as well as inequality, trauma prevention. A lot of it is actually not to do with the criminal justice system.
Absolutely, and that's what I would say is a key challenge at the moment, which is that in government, the departments who are tasked with this agenda are the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office, and yet they don't have within their departments the means to basically reduce crime and reoffending, because the things that the criminal justice system can deliver are incredibly narrow, and the reasons why people commit crime or they reoffend, the answers to that, for the most part, as you can see from the word cloud, lie completely outside the criminal justice system and the police system. So it is health, it's unemployment, it's education, it's family breakdown. It's all these things which are why people commit crime in the first place and keep on doing so. And yet our system is, people believe that things within the system, like sentences, will resolve those drivers to crime when they never will. And somehow we need to get the rest of the system to help on those drivers to crime, and it's not happening at the moment.
Ian, is it back to Tony Blair's tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime?
Well, that didn't exactly deliver, did it? And the mantra is similar across the political landscape, but successive generations of politicians have gone into their positions of authority with the idea that prison works, and when you make more prison space, it'll all be okay. Well, it isn't going to happen. You're not going to build your way out of a criminal justice system crisis by building more prison cells. That's the polemic we need to change. And so we're really saying two things. Investment, as Andrew has said, is absolutely key. But also we need a proper public and political debate about what direction do you want your criminal justice system to go in. Is it more prisons, 4 billion has been announced, or is it the much cheaper option of rehabilitation under supervision of probation? And the other thing which we'll return to over the course of this discussion is the role of probation within Her Majesty's Probation and Prison Service. It's disastrous. It's a prison-centric, top-down system that does none of the things that you want it to do, as you've already identified.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, how much of this is a political problem rather than a policy problem? And certainly when we were doing the Times Crime and Justice Commission, just looking back over decades, you've had this sort of ratcheting up of sentences because politicians just compete with one another. And actually, is there now a chance with the new Secretary of State, the sentencing bill, the government does seem to be setting out on a different course?
I mean, I think on the 6th of July last year, we thought the government was on a different course because we had a Prime Minister who for the first time talked about prisons and recognised that there needed to be a public discussion about what prisons could and can't do. That's basically because on day one, he was forced with the reality that the prisons were all full and you know, quite sure, and without being conspiracy theorists, that's one of the reasons we had the election when we did, that the previous Prime Minister wasn't willing to have early release. So it began, I think, quite well, and then obviously the appointment of James Timpson was broadly welcome, somebody who understands prisons, knows who's in them, understands what they can and can't achieve. I'm afraid since then it's been kind of disappointment upon disappointment. I think the Gork review earlier in the year had promise, and certainly the tenets of it, that, you know, penal populism,
yes.
Penal populism had driven, as Ian said, you know, decades of inflated sentences and this kind of accepted narrative that prison works back to Michael Howard, when all of the evidence shows that prison doesn't work. And every minister who's ever been prisons minister will sit there in meetings with me, and I had 5 of them before I had James in my 4 years at the Howard League, you know, would sit there and say, they just don't work. Like, they're just full of people who need to be in hospital or who need other interventions, or, you know, and we can't keep people safe. But at the same time, you know, we've now got a political landscape where the opposition is pulling the government further and further to the right. There is no opposition to the left. The Liberal Democrats have apparently been captured on criminal justice completely by Labor, so they may as well just be Labor for the purposes of Parliament. So there is no kind of in principle objection. And the sentencing bill, I think all of us find to be pretty sorely disappointing. I mean, it is purely a mechanism to immediately bring down the prison population because they can't build their way out of the crisis. There is no vision for dealing with overcrowding. So 22,000 people in our prison system, of the 88,000 people in prison, 22,000 adult men are double bunked in a cell intended for a single person. Government's own evidence shows that when you're in an overcrowded prison, which is a lot of them, and some of these prisons are exactly the same prisons that my forebears were held in 200 years ago before they were transported, except they were new then and they're old now. They're very old, decrepit, disrespecter of people places. And the idea that you can put people in those places, as one of these people up here said, prison's not being effective for rehabilitation. We've got people locked in their cells for 22 to 24, 3 hours of a day, and without sufficient education, without training, without the mental health interventions, just cramming people into jails that are not healthy for human habitation, and then somehow expecting them to come out, to go over to Ian's members and to start, after however many years in those kind of environments where they are increasingly violent, filled with drugs and drones, scary places. It's just a disastrous system.
On the legislation, isn't the government at least trying to go in a different direction, or do you feel it's just not gone far enough?
They're trying a bit, but they have, a burning platform, which is prisons which are literally too full now and again not going to have room in a while, which is not a principled reason for reform. I just want to go back to the political parties issue, and that all the terrible policy is driven by, as it were, political competition. And I want to say I'm not sure that's the case. The most progressive we've had criminal justice in the last kind of 50 years was under Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. She had a big majority, and she chose to appoint Home Secretaries who in those days also controlled probation and prisons, who were really pretty progressive. And actually, Tony Blair had really big majorities. He could have chosen to do something different because he had such big majorities. And yet, New Labour doubled the prison population. And, that was the big rise. And his government put through bill after bill after bill of new criminal offences and so on. So I think it's a political choice, and unfortunately we got into a culture under New Labour of being super punitive and seeing criminal justice sanctions as the answer to social and health problems, which they are not.
I want to move on now to the next section, and the audience, you've got another question. So again on Slido, we're going to ask now, does the criminal justice system require a complete root and branch reform, if you like a tear down, or are there solutions that could work within and around existing structures and processes? So for you with the Slido, it's yes, no, don't know to that question. Does the criminal justice system require a tear down, root and branch reform? And while you're answering that, John, I'm going to come to you. What do you think? Does it require complete root and branch reform? And if so, what would some of your solutions be?
Yeah, one person's root and branch reform is another person's evolution. I don't think it's helpful on the prevention side to say, let's throw everything up in the air and start again. So let me explain what I mean. I would say the US system is in a bigger mess than our system, but violence across the US in main cities has fallen over the last year. Why has it fallen? Well, what are the main reasons, if you look at places like Baltimore, where they've had really serious, significant declines, is they've been running a program called Focused Deterrence. And that's a program where you identify who are the individuals who are most involved in violent activity in this city. We haven't got evidence to charge them, but we know who they are. We're going to then approach them and say, we know that you're involved, we're watching you, but we'd love never to have to arrest you and charge you. Would you like to get out of the group involvement that you're involved in? Here's an opportunity for training. Here's an opportunity for a job. Here's an opportunity for mentoring. Here's an opportunity for therapy. If you don't take it, we're going to police you. Now, the impact of that programme, and it's been trialled in Glasgow and found to work Chicago, Malmo, that's places that rhyme with O, is it tends to reduce violence by about levels of 30%. Now, we've just funded that to happen across 5 cities in England and Wales. It's not hard to grow that. There's actually a lot of programmes that we know can have an effect, but we do actually need to follow the evidence. And we have a real problem, I think, on the prevention side. 2 problems. One is we're not very good at following the evidence. So I'll give you a little example. We have these teams in local authorities called youth offending teams, youth justice teams, who support children when they're arrested. 96% of them offer knife education programs, weapon education programs when a child is arrested. Oh, it's not a good idea to carry a knife. You're more likely to get injured if you carry one. This is how the law works. There is no evidence that those programs work. I'm not saying that we know they don't, but there's no evidence that they do, and we're trialling them, testing them at the moment. It's madness to keep spending money on things that we don't have evidence for when we have really good evidence for other things, like mentoring, like caseworking and giving support. So the system is actually there, but we should move it towards what works. Final thing where the system needs a tweak. I find that political appointments often don't really know that much about bits of the system that really matter. So often senior politicians don't know what a youth offending team is, but they're actually a big limb of the state that works with children who are arrested. Often they don't know what alternative provision is, which is for children who are excluded from school. We've actually got some really good limbs in the state, but the brain is sometimes a bit detached from the limbs. So we should have a plan that actually says, let's get those limbs doing the stuff that works. I don't think that's revolution, but I think it could have a revolutionary effect.
So it's interesting, the audience is almost equally divided between yes and no, 42%, not even 48, 52, 42 each, and 17 don't know. Ian, what's your view?
So my blood pressure was pretty normal before I came in here, and then I saw someone in the last slide mention grailing. And let's not haul him before the court of inquiry, because you'd be here forever. But you know, the egregious damage he did by a social experiment to privatised probation has also caused a lot of the current day problems in that particular department. So our response has been very much member led. What practitioners tell me is we need to restore probation back to where it was, not throw everything up in the air and review it, because probation was formed of 36 independent trusts over a decade ago, and then Grayling got hold of it and destroyed it, basically. Now, that worked. It was a gold standard public service. It won awards all over for the service it provided, and we're rather looking backwards to solutions for now. If we got probation out of HMPPS, the prison-centric HMPPS, we think it could start to do better. All the things that colleagues here have been talking about, working with communities, being accountable to communities, building partnerships in a way it once did. So that would be the major reform that we'd be looking for insofar as it affects our members. And just to say, NAPO is a signatory to a motion from the Prison Officers Association traded in Congress a couple of years ago, calling for a royal commission into the criminal justice system. Now, heaven knows how long that would take. So what I'm trying to say is...
Times Commission.
Yeah, indeed. But yeah, that's going to take longer than we've got time for, really. And so for us, we want HMPPS to be decoupled from probation. And that's why we are pushing David Lemmy and previous Justice Secretaries to commission this review that was promised by Labour in its manifesto.
Penelope, what's your answer to that question? Does it need radical root and branch reform, or would a bit of evolution do?
Well, ideally you would have root and branch reform, because it clearly works so badly at the moment. And I want to give an illustration of how it does work really badly from the point of view actually of victims. So we did, we commissioned a poll from Public First of victims of crime, and half of them didn't even report the crime to the police, which is consistent with other statistics. And their first reason was it wasn't worth reporting. The second was police wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So we're letting down huge numbers of victims. And the ones who do report it, most of them, the crime is not resolved. And I think the other way when we're letting down victims is what we polled them on what they wanted to happen about the crime that had happened to them. And their top priority, victims' top priority, was that the person who did it shouldn't do it to somebody else again. So it wasn't even to them again, it was to somebody else again. And yet we're not delivering that for victims. So it wasn't a punitive, I mean, they are interested in punishment, but it wasn't their top thing. Their top thing is, can we support those people not to keep, not to do another offence? And everything we're doing in the system is not doing that. So critically, victims themselves are not getting justice. And I think the popularity of the play, I don't know if people have seen the play Punch, which is about a young man who punched somebody else when he was drunk outside a pub. Happens often, tragically in this case, the person he punched fell on the pavement and died, as can sometimes happen. So it was, in the end, it was manslaughter. He got a sentence for manslaughter because it was clear who'd done it to who. And that young man went to prison. The victims, the person who died, parents, were incredibly aggrieved about the length of the sentence. And they, in fact, appealed, as you can do, to the government to say that the sentence should be longer, because they felt that that was going to resolve their pain, to get a longer sentence. In that case, the judges refused to lengthen the sentence. They often do, but in this case, they didn't. And so these parents tried to find something else which would, in some way, kind of help them move on in their lives after this terrible tragedy. And in the end, they found out about, or somebody contacted them about restorative justice, which is where you meet the person who did the crime to you. And it happened, I mean, years afterwards, but it happened. And this was an absolute game changer, both, in fact, for the prisoner and for the poor, young man's parents. These victims, that was what helped them move on in their lives. Now, how much of that do we do in this system? Very little.
Andrea, what about you? Do you think it needs a complete transformation, or?
I mean, look, like Penelope, I think you'd need root and branch reform really to get to the heart of things. You need a fundamental rebalancing. You need to stop telling the public that prison works and talk about probation being the real protectors of the public.
And are there lessons from other countries where they do things differently?
I mean, I think like the whole framework in other countries. Rachel and I went to the Netherlands last year, and one of the things we did was go to a local court that was in the middle of an estate. And the judges there said that they just suspend every sentence because they only deal with minor offences. And at one stage I sort of said, so what are the minor offences you deal with? And she said, oh, well, minor things like domestic violence, street robbery, carrying a gun or a knife. And I'm thinking, like, I know somebody who got 12 years for carrying a knife. This is the way you classify and think about crime, I think, has to change. You need to restructure it all. But I mean, I think that the key thing for us is that the nonsense of the massive prison builds and investing billions of pounds in new prisons, when you're not committing to closing down the horrible old prisons, is just wasted money. You're just driving more and more people into a system that is known not to work. You're not dealing with overcrowding, when the government's own evidence shows that overcrowded prisons are just more violent. There's a terrible report that came out last week showing rates of suicide and self-harm skyrocketing over the next 5 years because of overcrowding. And mental health, like the failure to provide people with mental health support. And I spend my days going into prisons, and the vast majority of people I meet are normal people who have taken bad decisions in bad circumstances, and very few of them have ever known very good circumstances. And we don't have a public health approach. We just criminalise people. So when everybody's failed by housing and social services and education, I was very annoyed last week because Shabana Mahmood, who was then the Lord Chancellor, gave an interview to the Sunday Times. This is when I knew that she was going to be moving on, where she said she would have solved the prison crisis in 6 months' time, which was obviously a nonsense. But then later in the article, she went on to talk about how the Tories had ruined the country in 14 years rather, of an underinvestment in all the things that mattered. But the people in prison are the people who've suffered the hard consequences often of all of that, of the withdrawal of support for youth clubs, of mental health services being disappeared. And yet, when people fall foul of that and suffer the consequences of that, we throw them in prison.
John?
Just one thing to add. I mean, I'm not going to try and say that our prisons are brilliant places. That would be insane. And the youth estate is a disaster.
Terrible.
The only thing I say is I wouldn't, and I'm sure this isn't your view, but I wouldn't want to paint a picture that the state is sort of really active and take young people, every young person carrying a knife ends up with a criminal record. Generally, the state is inactive. So generally what happens is a child is, things fall apart at home, nothing much is done. A child messes up at school and gets suspended, no one really cares. A child gets excluded from school, doesn't turn up to the alternative provision, no one really does anything. A child gets referred for help, no one does anything. A child gets arrested carrying a knife, nothing happens. Generally, that's what the state is doing. Now, after the child might have carried a knife and been caught 3 or 4 times, you might see something happen. But
or when they use it and somebody dies.
Or when they use it, someone, if they work out who did it. But generally, it's very, very passive. And I think I would like to see a much more active state that actually is saying, hang on, this child's carrying a knife. What's going on? What's happening in your life? Well, how are we going to help you? How are we going to support you? Because the thing that I find so frustrating is when thinking about young people, we know who these children are. They're all the same children. The children who are severely absent from school, the children who've been arrested, the children who go missing, and the children who are excluded. And we actually have a really good system for spotting those children. We just don't do anything. And it just strikes me as the obvious thing to fix. And it is possible to do it. And it's not about massive universal, I would love to universally fund everything much more, but it's not about massive universal provision. It's about targeted support for the children who can't be supported by family and wider community.
And I'd just like to point out that for the action that isn't taken about a child carrying a knife, and I don't think we should be super punitive, but I think we should engage with that child as to why they're doing it. I would agree with Andrea that our frame of what is a crime has just got completely out of kilter. So, for instance, if somebody is in an encounter with a police officer and as often happens, they end up shouting at them, they can now get a 2-year prison sentence for shouting at them. Somebody also...
Is that because it's assault on a...
Yeah, assault on emergency worker. A shout can be an assault, so they can receive a 2-year prison sentence. That just seems... It's terrible to shout at police officers, but it's disproportionate to get a 2-year prison sentence for it. And again, I did a report on something called the single justice procedure, which actually deals with the majority of all criminal offences in this country. In this country, buying the wrong train ticket by mistake is a criminal offence. You can be prosecuted and convicted for that. I mean, that just seems absurd to me. You've made a mistake.
Ian, what about when people come out of prison? What needs to change so that they don't reoffend?
Well, they need support services, quite clearly, and as colleagues will testify, they are non-existent in some cases or very patchy. And under the current regime, the next place they're going to go after coming out of prison is surprising prison, because they're going to be recalled, because there's nowhere for them to go, no one to help them. So much of the current discord in the system is caused by the recall process, and it's a never-ending spiral. Just this week, I think something like 2,000 more early release offenders have come out. Fortunately for them, the probation service is not engaging in industrial action this week. We're very close, because of other issues I'll come to in a moment. Now, we don't want that to happen, but the probation service has been pushed to breaking point, and staff are leaving in droves, and these are skilled people. You can't just replace someone. So politicians need to wake up to the fact that for every action is a reaction, and something has to be done to create the circumstances where people coming out on early release are supported to a basic level of decency. And if you don't do that, then crime will just spiral.
I'm interested that the yes, tear it down is now overtaken no, find solutions. So maybe our panellists have shifted opinion in the room. But I want to, we're going to come to questions in a moment, but in the meantime, I want to ask each of the panellists for their brief vision for the future of the criminal justice system. So to sort of come back to you for some positive thoughts on what you'd like to see it look like in an ideal world. And I'm going to start with Andrea and go around.
I mean, I'd like to see a criminal justice system that is not about the criminal justice system. So where the focus is not actually on prisons, where the focus and the money is all put at the things that actually prevent crime, and where prison is reserved for people who are dangerous and need to be taken away to protect the public, for as long as they are dangerous. Because in this country, we lock people up for extraordinary lengths of time. We've sleptwalked our way into mass incarceration. I mean, that's the direction of travel, even compared to sentences that you would get in Northern Ireland or in Scotland. And I know people who are in the CCAT estate, the lifer estate, people who've been convicted of murder. There are a good number of them who actually have been caught up in joint enterprise, coming back to that sort of inequity, racial inequity and deep racism within the system. That is brings total shame upon our system, that you can give people life sentences and give them a conviction for murder when they were not present or did not contribute in any meaningful way. So I think there needs to be a real addressing of racial injustice and a move away from this idea that you just put people and warehouse them in prisons forever. Invest in the things that are not prison. That's what protects the public: probation, education, youth work, mental health services, hospitals. That's what you need.
John, what about you?
I'd like to see us really support our professionals. So we have some remarkable teachers who support vulnerable children. We have wonderful youth justice workers, some great youth workers, not enough of them, but we have some wonderful people. But we've been very poor at giving them the tools they need. What actually does the evidence suggest? Other colleagues have found work. And so my one wish would be for there to be easy access to that information. The Youth Endowment Fund is set up to try and play our part, and so people can now easily access something called the Youth Endowment Fund Toolkit, the YF Toolkit, which is basically like Which magazine for what works to prevent violence. And so I'd love to see professionals having the tools and making decisions based on what they know other professionals can do to change lives. It doesn't need more money, and I think we can actually see a real shift.
Interesting. Penelope?
My vision of a system has to start with, there is less crime and less people, fewer people are victimised. But to achieve that, I actually ironically think you shrink the formal criminal justice system. And as Andrea said, you get at the drivers of crime. We criminalise too many people, we prosecute too many people, we imprison too many people. It doesn't achieve anything. So a smaller system would be part of my vision, but where the people within the system who are in trouble with the law are supported to move on afterwards. So another kind of thing that my charity Transform Justice and a charity called Unlock campaign about is the reform of criminal records. So as well as imprisoning everybody forever, we also, for some quite minor offences, we make them pay for decades afterwards through our criminal record system, even if they haven't committed another crime in those decades.
Okay. Ian, what's your vision for the future?
Well, we need to look at past practices I've referenced, but also some current work that's going on between our members and academics with intrinsic knowledge of the probation system in Wales. We have an oven-ready solution of devolution of the probation service to the Welsh Government that could quite equally be applied across the rest of the UK. So we'll be lobbying ministers on that as well as other things.
What do they do differently?
Well, it's not so much what the Wales model does, is all the things colleagues have been talking about. Engages with communities, builds partnerships with providers, reduces the capacity to immediately looking for long-term prison sentences, and we agree there are some crimes where people, for their own safety and that of the public, need to be in prison, and our members won't balk from that. But the numbers of people, and women particularly, across the women's estate, is disgusting. How many people are in prison? Many of these women themselves victims of joint enterprise, or being stitched up by their partners, and finding themselves, away from their children. So there's an awful lot of stuff that could be done in the short term. But I will commend the Wales model. We haven't had time to look at it today, obviously. And maybe I can circulate that through to the Nesta folk and they can circulate it around. But that's developing well, and I think if we can get ahead of steam and get the government to agree to a review of probation, that's a really positive start. But even that will take time. Yeah.
So are there any questions from the floor? Yes, I'm going to take 3 at once so people can jump in on different ones. There's a question here at the front.
Hello, my name is Joanna, and I'm a psychologist, and I actually started my career in a prison, worked with probation, and now I work in rail. And my question is a bit around how we reconcile the two sides. So what I mean by this is, of course, as a psychologist working with people that have been in prison or supervised by probation, I've seen basically the context in which they grow, in which they develop, and how that impacts the likelihood of them committing a crime. Then moving into rail and seeing, for the few of you that might not know, rail has really high levels of work-related violence. So we have frontline staff consistently assaulted, abused, harassed. And what I've been trying to do in my work is to help sometimes the rail industry understand that actually imprisoning people is not going to solve the issue. So having them look more upstream. But it is a really hard conversation to have because it almost looks like you either are on the side of supporting people before they actually get involved in crime, or you are on the side of supporting the victims once they experience it. So I wondered if you had any views on how we can put the two together, because of course, we will never reach a solution unless we sort of look at it holistically.
Interesting. There was a question here.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I work at YouGov, so I work in public opinion. So my question is kind of similar linked. It's around how politics and public opinion kind of interact with each other, and how, unfortunately, a lot of the public have a lack of sympathy for the state of the prisons, and essentially how you see that kind of tackling that issue in terms of prison reform and the stuff that we've spoken about today. How can we tackle the lack of sympathy amongst the public?
Maybe we should take those 2 questions and then come back for another round because they go quite well together. Andrea, do you want to start? I mean, I suppose what it's saying is do people have enough sympathy to understand, or empathy to understand the long-term benefits of taking a more preventive approach?
I mean, I think there is... I really object to the idea of setting perpetrators of crime and those of us who are involved in reform of prisons or penal reform against victims. I mean, I'm not, as I often have to say on GB News, I'm not pro-shoplifting or pro-rape. I'm against all of those things. The point is that the system we have does not work. A huge number of people inside prison have been victims of crime. It's in a way that is, I think, now broadly understood with respect to the women's estate. But and ministers will sit there and say, well, they understand that most women in prison have been subject to being victims of domestic abuse or other crimes. They don't accept that for the male estate when that is also true. So that there's a very fine line, I think, between victim and perpetrator. And I think we just have to understand that what we all want is less crime, and people to be supported to move away, to be able to change their lives and move away from crime and get the support they need when they're in the community.
John, go ahead. No, John. I remember when, in fact, YouGov did some research for the Times Crime and Justice Commission, which found people have much more nuanced views actually when you talk to them in the round about do you want to prevent crime and what. They were happy to have sort of community punishments if they realised that was better for preventing crime.
Yeah.
They're not actually vindictive, generally. Some people are. What's your reflection on this sort of about how you almost explain / sell this to the public?
I think there has to be a bit of levelling with a public sort of instinct, which I don't think is mad. right? Because I feel it too. And I think some of that is, look, when Michael Howard said prison works, I think obviously there's reasons to say that's not true. There's no evidence on the rehabilitative effect. The way in which we run the prisons is a complete disaster. They're terrible, terrible places. Far too many people go to them. Some of the sentences are crazy. But we do need to also wrestle that there is more than an effect of prison that is about rehabilitation. The children the children who go to prison at Eusted has fallen dramatically. But do I think it should be 0? I would like the Eusted to look incredibly different, but I do think there are children who should not have their liberty fully for all periods of their childhood. And I think that is a normal position, actually, that most people hold. And that's not because I always think it's rehabilitative. There just are cases where a person being outside of the general public for the period they're in prison makes the public safer. Then also, we do need to recognise there is a deterrent effect of consequences. These things are very hard to get to. My organisation runs evaluation. Deterrent effect and a removal effect is really hard to measure. It's quite easy to measure the lack of the rehabilitative effect, which absolutely, Howard League are absolutely right, it's very, very, very weak. So I just think you've got to level with the public a bit and say, I don't think it's fair to say prison doesn't work. I think it's right to say that the way we do prison is mad, and that prison is very poor at rehabilitation. But I think you've got to acknowledge we need, and I'm sure the Howard League would say the same, we need some degree of removal of liberty. And then you can have a more practical argument. Who should actually be in prison? What is the purpose of prison? For how long? How much money do we want to spend on it? I think you've got to get into that space rather than absolute binaries.
Penelope, how do you think the argument can be won?
I mean, I think the workplace violence issue is very interesting. And in fact, we did do a report on assaults on what are called emergency workers, and they are prison officers and police officers and people in the health service and so on. And there's the similar problem with people who work in shops, as in rail, etc. And, you know, I think there are approaches which are resolving the situation and kind of getting the person not to do it again, which are not super punitive. And the issue we have is just this belief amongst both the public in their individual lives, but also in their working lives, that, you know, the more you punish through criminal sanctions, that's going to be the answer. And it just isn't the answer. So actually, when we did a report on assaults on emergency workers, and we would love the criminal sanctions not to be as kind of punitive as they are, but they are where they are legislatively. But what we did is we engaged with the unions and we engaged with the organisations like the NHS and so on, and just tried to kind of take them through a bit about how the criminal justice system works and whether these things were actually going to work or not. Because particularly in the workplace context, what people want is for that behaviour to stop. That's the critical thing. And actually, you know, there's ways and means like restorative justice or using what are called this terrible jargon term, out-of-court resolutions, where you can move towards getting people not to do it again. So, and I would say as well, I think we need to look at society as well, because a lot of the bad behaviour towards railway workers and so on is actually doesn't meet the criminal threshold. It's just terrible behaviour, and it shouldn't happen. And I've been embarrassed in shops at how people have dealt with the workers in shops. So I think it goes beyond kind of like, let's just increase the maximum sentence for 1 year to 2 years, to what can we do as a society and a better understanding of how to stop that behaviour.
Let's have another couple of questions. We've got 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to go here. And then there was a question, I think, at the front as well.
Thank you. I work in violence against women and girls policy, which is obviously quite a politically charged issue at the moment as well. And part of the work, my brief, is intensive supervision courts and specialist domestic abuse courts, which the government has committed to expanding. And obviously the evidence shows that the outcomes from these can be very positive for perpetrator and for victims. And also working on statutory defences as well, which we're pushing for. But I guess it's, especially at this moment, how do we, for such an emotionally charged issue, evidence that these models are really effective to the public, particularly from a comms perspective? Because people think it sort of can be light justice and it doesn't reflect the sort of severity of the issues. Thank you.
Okay. And then there was a question here.
Thank you. So I had a question, which was, what initiatives do you think can be put in place to improve trust and collaboration between the community and police? So now communities, especially in, let's say, Lambeth, Southwark, they don't tend to trust the police force because they don't believe that the police force is actually protecting them. And many are actually hostile of the police. So I think that some measures need to be put in place in order to build this trust so both the community and the police force can work together. I just wanted to hear some suggestions or ideas that you think of.
Okay, thank you. Ian, do you want to come in on the problem-solving court question? Because internationally, there's so much evidence, isn't there?
There is evidence, and in Holland, they're closing prisons, I think,
Yep.
and other countries. So I know there was some work done up in Scotland. Well, we don't have any members in Scotland, but they targeted areas and had things like problem-solving courts and resolution-type discussions, and the crime rate went down in those areas quite
And
markedly.
they've done it in England as well.
And they have. So, there's evidence there of things at work. And this is about getting that message across. And, two things from the last question, if I may. If you engage someone about does prison work or not, and they say everyone should be in prison, they throw the key away, you ask them how much it costs to put someone in prison. Not a lot of people know. It's about 60k for a year at current rates, as opposed to something like 4k to manage someone on a licence under the probation service. It's a no-brainer, isn't it, you'd have thought. So there's that to be one. But until we get politicians to show the gumption to have this debate out in the open and take bold decisions, we're going to be stuck in this cycle. So, but I'm all for resolutions, restorative justice. We've done a lot of studies. Probation Journal is worth looking at. It's online, actually, for you academics out there. Really excellent piece of work, and that posits a whole range of solutions. So, yeah.
John, have you come across any interesting ideas on the police trust issue?
Yeah, I agree with your description. I think what's interesting, we did a massive survey of young people about their levels of trust of policing. And two things were kind of interesting about it for me. So one was children who didn't trust the police broke down into two groups, and there was overlap. One was we don't trust them to be fair when they come, particularly we think they may be biased when it comes to race. But the second was we don't think they'll come and do anything at all. Those are really different things. And so I think we just need to recognise, I think we can just think it's about one of those two things, but actually it's about both. The other one was we found that children who had, and this is an odd one, children who had contact with the police had higher rates of trust of the police, including if they'd had contact with the police because the police thought they'd done something wrong. That's interesting, right? That's counterintuitive and not what you would expect. Now, what it suggests isn't that the police are great, but it's just they might not be quite as bad as the perception that we have of them. That's the most natural conclusion to come to. Not that the police are fine, but perception may have got ahead of the reality. I think the main thing I tend to say on this stuff is the evidence is a bit weak about what actually works here, but the most obvious thing to build trust is to be trustworthy. Like if you're trustworthy, people start to trust you. And I kind of think we can get a bit distracted with town halls, events and so on. If you're reliably in a neighbourhood and you problem solve, and the evidence for reducing crime is problem solving, what's actually happening here? What's the underlying cause of it? How can we fix it? The final bit would be the way you treat people. I'm fortunate I've been stopped and searched once in my life. It made me less trusting of the police. Not because I thought it was unfair to stop and search me, but like the way I was talked to at the end of it when I was found I'd done nothing wrong made me feel like I was a baddie. And that's what so many of us experience. It's very easy to close well. Look, I know that was hard. Thank you for being a good citizen, for doing it. You've helped make this place safer, and I really appreciate what you did. And good police do that. It's a small thing that can make a bit of a difference.
I think that's a really good note to end on. So thank you all very much. Be trustworthy to win trust. I think that's a great motto for life as well as the public services, actually. So thank you all very much to the panel and to all of you.